While everyone's busy arguing about whether boomers ruin the economy or if millennials are killing the napkin industry, there's this whole group of people in between who just quietly went about their business. Picture this. It's 1985, and millions of kids across America are coming home to empty houses. They're letting themselves in with keys hanging around their necks, microwaving their own dinners, and basically running their own lives at age 10. Back then, there were no helicopter parents, no playdates, and basically no supervision. They were required to figure things out on their own, and somehow we just forgot about them. And here's the thing, they're completely fine with being forgotten. Actually, they prefer it, which when you think about it is a bit weird. What kind of generation doesn't want attention? Well, it turns out that the answer to that question reveals something rather fascinating about human psychology and how childhood experiences shape who we become. The thing is, we can look at the X's as a psychological case study in what happens when an entire generation grows up feeling expendable. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, Gen X grew up in a world that was fundamentally different from anything that came before or after it. As I've already explained, they were the latchkey kids, the ones who came home to empty houses and figured things out on their own. Their parents were busy climbing corporate ladders, getting divorced at record rates, and generally doing their own thing. So Gen X learned early on that nobody was coming to save them. But here's where it gets interesting from a psychological perspective. That kind of childhood fundamentally shapes how you see the world. When you're 8 years old and you're letting yourself into an empty house, making your own snacks and entertaining yourself until your parents get home from work, you develop a very specific mindset. You become self-reliant. You stop expecting help. You figure out that complaining doesn't change anything, so you might as well just deal with it. Now don't get me wrong, this isn't some romantic notion about building character through hardship. It's literally how their brains got wired. Developmental psychology tells us that the experiences we have between ages 5 and 15 create neural pathways that stick with us for life. Gen X spent those crucial years learning that they were on their own, and that lesson never left. Think about what they witnessed growing up. The Cold War was the background noise of their entire childhood. They did nuclear attack drills in school. They grew up with the very real possibility that the world could end at any moment. That kind of existential dread doesn't just disappear when you turn 18. It settles into your bones and becomes a baseline anxiety that colors everything else. Then there was the media they consumed. Gen X didn't have the internet. They had 3 TV channels, maybe 4 if they were lucky. They watched the Challenger explode live on television. They saw the AIDS crisis unfold in real time, watching it go from a mysterious illness to a full-blown epidemic that killed people they knew or admired. They witnessed the crack epidemic destroy communities. They saw economic recessions hit their families hard. And through it all, there was this growing sense that the American dream their parents had promised was starting to crack. But here's what's especially fascinating. Instead of becoming bitter or angry, Gen X became cynical. And there's a huge psychological difference between those two things. Bitterness is personal. It's when you feel wronged and you want revenge or recognition. Cynicism is protective. It's when you expect the worst, so you're never disappointed. Gen X developed a thick layer of irony and sarcasm against a world that kept letting them down. This shows up everywhere in their cultural output. Look at the music, grunge, alternative rock, hip-hop's golden age. All of it had this undercurrent of everything's broken, and we're just here to document it. Kurt Cobain wasn't trying to inspire a revolution. He was trying to survive his own mind. Tupac was telling stories about systemic failure. The whole aesthetic of the 90s was about acknowledging that things were messed up without pretending you could fix them. And the movies! Whew! Gen X gave us Fight Club, The Matrix, Reality Bites, Slacker, Pulp Fiction. Every single one of these films is about people who feel disconnected from the system they're supposed to be part of. They're about finding meaning in a meaningless world. They're about rejecting the narratives you were sold and trying to figure out what's actually real. This is where the psychology gets even more interesting. Gen X developed what researchers call an external locus of control. That's a fancy way of saying they don't believe they have much power to change the big systems around them. And honestly, can you blame them? They watched corporations downsize their parents. They graduated into recessions. They saw political scandals prove that the people in charge were just as messed up as everyone else. The lesson they learned was, the game is rigged, so don't expect to win. But, and this is crucial, that doesn't mean they gave up. They just stopped playing by the rules. Gen X became entrepreneurs, freelancers, and independent contractors before it was cool. They didn't trust corporations to take care of them, so they created their own paths. They're the generation that started the tech boom, simply because they saw an opportunity to do things differently. This is the paradox of Gen X psychology. They're simultaneously cynical and pragmatic, disillusioned and resourceful. They don't believe in the system, but they've figured out how to live with it. They don't trust institutions, but they've built their own networks. They're not waiting for someone to save them because they learned a long time ago that nobody's coming. And then there's the whole thing about being forgotten. Gen X is the smallest generation in modern American history. There are only about 65 million of them, compared to 72 million boomers and 72 million millennials. They're literally outnumbered on both sides. So they grew up invisible, and they've stayed that way. The culture war has been fought between boomers and millennials, with Gen X just watching from the sidelines, probably making sarcastic comments. Again, Gen X likes to be forgotten, at least in a way. They're not fighting for attention or recognition. They're not posting think pieces about how misunderstood they are. They're just living their lives, doing their thing, and occasionally rolling their eyes at everyone else's drama. This is deeply psychological. When you grow up neglected, you either become desperate for attention or you become comfortable in the shadows. Most Gen X folks chose the latter. There's also something to be said about their relationship with technology. Gen X is the bridge generation. They remember life before the internet, but they adapted to it as adults. They're not digital natives like millennials and Gen Z, but they're not technologically helpless like many boomers. They learned to code when coding wasn't cool. They were on message boards and early social media before everyone's parents joined Facebook. They understand both worlds, which gives them a unique perspective. This technological fluency without technological dependence is actually a huge psychological advantage. Gen X can unplug without having an existential crisis. They remember that life existed before everyone was online all the time. But they're also comfortable enough with technology to use it effectively. They're not afraid of it, but they're not addicted to it either. They have a healthy skepticism that comes from watching multiple tech bubbles burst. And let's talk about their parenting style for a bit, because this is where you really see the psychology play out. Gen X parents are determined not to repeat what happened to them. They're not leaving their kids home alone for hours. They're involved, present, and protective, sometimes to a fault. They're also teaching independence in ways their parents never did. They want their kids to be self-sufficient, but they also want them to feel supported. It's a fragile balance, and to be fair, they're probably overcompensating in some ways. Of course, this overcompensation has created some tension. Gen X raised millennials and older Gen Z, and there's definitely some friction there. Gen X looks at younger generations and thinks they're too sensitive, too dependent on validation, too quick to complain. Meanwhile, younger generations look at Gen X and think they're too detached, too cynical, too unwilling to fight for change. Both perspectives make sense given their different experiences. But here's what Gen X understands that maybe younger generations don't. Sometimes you have to pick your battles. Sometimes the best way to survive is to keep your head down and do your work. Sometimes cynicism is just realism with better jokes. They're not trying to be inspirational. They're trying to be honest, And admittedly, there's something refreshing about people who just tell it like it is. There's also this interesting thing about Gen X and mental health. They grew up in an era where therapy was stigmatized and tough it out was the default advice for any emotional problem. Depression wasn't talked about. Anxiety wasn't a diagnosis, it was called being stressed. Trauma was something that happened to war veterans, not regular kids. So Gen X learned to deal with their problems privately, often through humor and deflection. This has had lasting effects. Gen X has higher rates of untreated mental health issues than younger generations, partly because they came of age before mental health awareness became mainstream. They're the generation most likely to say, "I'm fine," when they're definitely not fine. They use sarcasm as therapy and self-deprecating humor as a coping mechanism. It works, sort of, until it doesn't. But there's also been a shift. As Gen X has gotten older and watched their kids benefit from better mental health resources, some of them, albeit not many, have started to address their own stuff. They're going to therapy, sometimes reluctantly. They're acknowledging that maybe growing up the way they did wasn't entirely healthy. They're trying to break cycles. It's not easy, and they're definitely not posting about their healing journey on Instagram, but it is happening. Money is another huge psychological factor for Gen X. They graduated into a recession in the early 90s, watched the dot-com bubble burst just as they were hitting their stride. They got hammered by the 2008 financial crisis during their peak earning years. They've been financially broken so many times that they've developed a deep distrust of economic stability. They save obsessively. They're skeptical of get-rich-quick schemes. They assume the worst could happen at any moment because, in their experience, it usually does. This financial anxiety has shaped everything, from their career choices to their retirement planning. They're working longer than they expected to. They're supporting both their aging parents and their adult children. They're the sandwich generation, squeezed from both sides. And they're handling it the only way they know how, by putting their heads down and just dealing with it. And yet, despite all of this, the neglect, the cynicism, the financial instability, and being forgotten, Gen X has this weird resilience. They're survivors. They don't actually believe things will get better, but they keep going anyway. They've been counted out so many times that they've stopped caring what anyone thinks. They're just doing their thing, living their lives, and occasionally laughing at the absurdity of it all. This generation has achieved a level of acceptance that comes from years of disappointment. They learn to work with what reality gives them. They're not trying to change the world, but trust me, they will do almost anything to make their corner of it slightly less terrible, which might be the healthiest approach of all. In the end, the psychology of Gen X is the psychology of survival. It's about learning to be okay when things aren't okay. It's about finding humor in darkness. It's about being self-reliant without being selfish, cynical without being cruel, and realistic without being hopeless. They're the generation that learned to expect nothing and appreciate everything. They're the ones who understand that life isn't fair, but you gotta show up anyway. So yeah, Gen X doesn't get talked about much. They're not the loudest generation, not the biggest, not the most influential by traditional measures. But they're the ones who kept everything running while everyone else was fighting. They're the middle managers, the freelancers, the entrepreneurs, the parents who broke cycles, the people who figured out how to survive in a world that never quite made sense. And the most Gen X thing about all of this? They don't need you to understand them. They're fine either way. They've been fine this whole time. They'll be fine tomorrow. Because that's what they learned to do a long time ago. Sitting in an empty house with a TV dinner, waiting for someone who might not come home until late. They learned to be fine on their own. And what do you think you would do if you had to grow up like this? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel if you want to find out more interesting facts about how and why different people think the way they do. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.